Chapter 1. The Invitation. It was one of those New England spring mornings when Cabot Cove felt particularly like a postcard, sunlight filtering through maple trees just beginning to bud, and the scent of the ocean drifting gently over the harbor. Jessica Fletcher, best-selling author and unofficial town sleuth, sat in her kitchen, a cup of coffee in hand, the morning paper open but largely ignored. Her attention had been caught by a thick ivory envelope that had arrived in that morning's post. She reached for it again, brushing her fingers over the embossed gold letters, Thistlewood Hall Writers' Retreat. It came from Maine, a few hours' drive north. The letter inside, penned in looping theatrical handwriting, was from Randolph Fielding, founder and director of the retreat. He invited her to spend a weekend as the guest of honor, to inspire, observe, and, of course, enlighten a select group of emerging writers. "Well," she murmured aloud, "how can a girl resist that?" Jessica smiled to herself, folding the letter neatly and placing it beside her toast. It had been a quiet month, no murders, no mysterious disappearances, no town council feuds. It was almost unnerving. And though she wouldn't admit it openly, she sometimes welcomed a change of scenery. A weekend away, nestled in the hills of coastal Maine, with literary minds and perhaps a good glass of wine, sounded perfectly harmless. At least, that's what she told herself. Thistlewood Hall, when she arrived that Friday, stood impressively on a forested bluff above the sea. The winding drive led her through rows of wind-weathered pines, their trunks bending ever so slightly in the breeze. The mansion itself was 3 stories of stone and shingle, with ivy crawling up one side, and a turret that looked as though it belonged in a Bronte novel. She was met at the grand oak door by Clarissa Trent, a poised woman in her 30s with perfectly coiffed hair and a clipboard permanently attached to her arm. "Miss Fletcher," Clarissa greeted her with warmth, too rehearsed to be genuine. "We're thrilled to have you. The others have been eagerly awaiting your arrival." "I hope I'm not too late," Jessica said with a smile, stepping inside. The entrance hall was all dark wood and brass, with oil portraits lining the walls and a grandfather clock ticking solemnly in the corner. "Not at all. Dinner isn't until 7. Would you care for a tour or a moment to settle in?" Jessica opted for the latter, grateful for the chance to freshen up after her drive. Her room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking a tidy garden where daffodils bloomed in neat rows. The space had an air of faded elegance, lace curtains, an antique writing desk, and a vase of slightly drooping roses. Later, in the drawing room, the other guests had gathered, drinks in hand. Clarissa introduced them one by one. Claudia Lee, a memoirist with sharp red lipstick and sharper opinions. Peter Langford, a painfully shy poet. Elsie Drummond, retired headmistress turned mystery blogger. And Simon Gray, a crime novelist known for grisly paperbacks with names like Murder on the Moors. Their host, Randolph Fielding, entered last. Tall, charming, and just a shade too slick, he had the air of a man used to applause. "Jessica Fletcher," he said, taking her hand. "An honor. We've all admired your work for years." "You flatter me," Jessica replied, noting the way his eyes scanned the room as he spoke. Always performing, she thought. Dinner was an elegant affair, herb-roasted chicken, lemon potatoes, and a chilled white wine that did more to loosen tongues than any invitation. Conversation flowed easily at first, revolving around books, publishing gripes, and humorous tales from the writing trenches. But the mood shifted abruptly when Claudia Lee leaned forward and tapped her glass. "Let's get one thing clear," she said, her tone cutting through the room like a blade. "Some of us have reputations we intend to protect. If I find out anyone here has been lifting material, you'd better believe I'll call it out." Peter Langford turned pink. Simon Gray rolled his eyes. Randolph laughed a little too heartily. "I think we can all agree," he said smoothly, "that creativity can sometimes result in, shall we say, overlap?" Claudia's eyes narrowed. "Plagiarism isn't overlap, Randolph." Jessica remained quiet, observing the exchange. Conflict, she had learned long ago, often revealed more than camaraderie. After dessert, the group retreated to the parlour, where Clarissa had prepared a short icebreaker. Each guest would read a paragraph of their current project. Peter mumbled through a melancholic verse. Simon read a particularly violent passage that made even Randolph wince. Claudia's contribution was a scene describing a literary agent being found dead with a manuscript clutched in his cold hands. "Charming," Elsie muttered. Jessica declined to read. "I prefer to listen," she said, sipping her tea. "You learn more that way." Eventually, guests retired to their rooms. Jessica paused in the hallway, noting how Peter hesitated before disappearing into the small library. Claudia lingered by the staircase, lighting a cigarette despite the posted sign. Back in her room, Jessica opened her notebook and jotted a few things down. The tension, the glances, the veiled remarks. It was all beginning to feel familiar, not dangerous, not yet. But she knew the signs, and she had a feeling this weekend would be anything but restful. Chapter 2. An interrupted reading. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, a veil of mist hanging low over the trees surrounding Thistlewood Hall. Jessica Fletcher woke early, as was her habit, and spent a quiet hour by the window with her notebook, noting the subtle signs she had observed the night before. Claudia's pointed accusation, Randolph's evasive chuckle, and Peter's almost painful discomfort. After a light breakfast served by an invisible kitchen staff, Clarissa claimed they preferred to remain in the background. The guests gathered in the main parlour for the first workshop session. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle around a low oak table where stacks of printed pages were waiting, each bearing the heading Creative Spark Exercise, Honesty and Secrets. Jessica noted the prompt title with mild amusement. "A curious choice," she remarked, as she took her seat beside Elsie Drummond. "It's supposed to get us to dig deeper," Elsie whispered, adjusting her glasses. "Personally, I prefer digging into clues." Randolph Fielding swept into the room, clapping his hands like a schoolmaster, eager to impress. "Now, everyone," he said brightly, "today's focus is emotional honesty in writing. That means sharing work that makes you a little uncomfortable." The silence that followed was brittle. "To get us started," he continued, "we'll have a reading session before lunch. Who'd like to volunteer?" Claudia Lee raised her hand with a theatrical sigh. "I suppose I must lead by example." She stood, retrieved a folder from her satchel, and opened it with a flair. "This is a new piece, a memoir, naturally. I've called it Ink and Poison." Jessica glanced at Simon Gray, who rolled his eyes dramatically. Claudia began reading in her low, smoky voice. The scene she described was strikingly vivid. A young writer, betrayed by her mentor, accused falsely of theft, and cast out from a prestigious fellowship. Her words were laced with venom, each sentence more loaded than the last. Midway through the reading, Peter Langford suddenly stood up. Excuse me," he muttered, and left the room, knocking over his chair in the process. Claudia didn't pause. If anything, she raised her voice slightly, eyes gleaming with something sharp and deliberate. When she finally finished, the room held a long, uncomfortable silence. "Thank you, Claudia," Randolph said after a beat, rising to his feet and applauding lightly. "Brave and unfiltered?" "I thought we were supposed to be honest," she said sweetly. Jessica set her notebook aside and smiled gently. Sometimes honesty can benefit from kindness. Claudia offered no reply, merely arching an eyebrow before returning to her seat. The tension remained like a draft under a closed door, unseen but felt. Lunch was delayed. Peter did not return. As guests milled about the library and conservatory, Jessica wandered quietly through the west corridor, where the bedrooms and private study rooms were located. She found Peter sitting alone in a small reading nook, a half-drunk cup of tea on the window ledge beside him. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. He looked up, startled. "Oh, no, please. Sorry for earlier." "No need to apologize," Jessica said, sitting across from him. "But may I ask, did Claudia's story strike a bit close to home?" He hesitated. "She wrote about me, not directly, but it's clear. We worked together years ago. I was just starting out. She gave me advice and later accused me of stealing her material. It wasn't true." Jessica nodded slowly. "Did you ever confront her?" He shook his head. What would be the point? Jessica left him there, troubled but calm, and returned to the parlor just as Randolph was announcing the afternoon session. Before it could begin, a crash echoed from the hallway. Clarissa rushed in. "Something's happened, Claudia!" Everyone scrambled after her, through the corridor and down the servants' staircase, the narrow, rarely used back steps that led to the old kitchen. At the foot of the staircase, in a crumpled heap, lay Claudia Lee. She was still, motionless. Clarissa covered her mouth. "Oh my God!" Randolph turned to Jessica, voice trembling. "Call someone, please!" Jessica moved calmly but quickly to the front parlor, where the landline rested by the fireplace. As she called emergency services, her eyes caught something near the base of the stairs, a shoe scuff on the old wood, fresh, deep. By the time the local constable arrived, a middle-aged man named Sergeant Brewer, everyone had gathered in the drawing room. Brewer questioned them briefly, informing them that, pending autopsy, the death would be treated as an accident. "She fell," he said. "Old stairs, poor lighting. Maybe she tripped." Jessica stepped forward. "Sergeant, forgive me, but may I point something out?" He looked at her with a touch of amusement. "You're the writer, aren't you?" "I am, but I've also seen a fair number of cases over the years." She paused. Claudia was wearing low heels, and the banister has fresh paint. Slick, perhaps, but not worn down. If she fell, she didn't fall naturally. Brewer's face grew serious. "You think someone pushed her?" "I'm not saying that yet." Jessica's tone was gentle but firm, but I do think it would be premature to close the case. Outside, the sky had turned a shade darker. The mood inside matched it. No longer simply a weekend retreat, Thistlewood Hall had shifted into something far more complex and dangerous. Jessica Fletcher returned to her room as the sun dipped below the trees, her mind already turning over the facts. A story cut short, a history of accusation, and a house full of secrets. She reached for her notebook. The plot, it seemed, had only just begun. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Library. The storm arrived just after dusk, creeping in on a stiff wind that rattled the window panes and sent tree branches scraping against the eaves of Thistlewood Hall. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Conversations grew more cautious, voices lowered to hushed murmurs. Dinner had been a quiet affair, with Claudia Lee's empty chair casting a larger shadow than her presence ever had. Jessica Fletcher sat by the fireplace in the library, a volume of early American poetry open in her lap. She wasn't reading, not really. Her eyes occasionally skimmed the lines, but her thoughts wandered back to the bottom of the staircase. The awkward sprawl of Claudia's limbs, the fresh scratch along the banister's wood, the slight but unmistakable smear on the polished floorboards. Something didn't sit right. The library, though dimly lit, was a comforting space, walls lined with leather-bound books, a grandfather clock ticking patiently in the corner, and the soft, worn creak of armchairs being occupied and abandoned. Jessica had always found libraries calming, a place for reflection, and in this case, for observation. She wasn't alone. Across the room, Simon Gray sat at a writing desk, rifling through a stack of loose papers, muttering under his breath. Near the window, Elsie Drummond was engaged in conversation with Randolph Fielding, who appeared uncharacteristically subdued. Clarissa floated through now and then, offering tea or biscuits no one seemed to want. Peter Langford had vanished after supper, claiming a headache. Jessica rose quietly and wandered toward the bookshelves at the far end of the room. She ran her fingers along the spines, letting them rest on a battered green copy of A Study in Scarlet. "A classic choice," came a voice behind her. She turned to find Simon Gray watching her. "You're a Holmes fan, I take it?" she asked. "When I was 10, he said, flashing a grin. "These days I prefer my detectives a little grittier, but I admire the structure." Conan Doyle knew how to build tension. Jessica smiled. "So did Agatha Christie." Simon snorted. "She always kept it tidy, neat little endings. In real life, things are messier." Jessica tilted her head slightly. "Yes, but real life rarely ends in a drawing room confession. Fiction helps us believe there's order in the chaos." Simon narrowed his eyes, then abruptly changed the subject. "You think Claudia fell? Or do you believe the whispers going around?" Jessica regarded him evenly. "What whispers?" "Oh, come on. Everyone's thinking it. Claudia had enemies. You heard her yesterday throwing accusations around like darts. That sort of thing doesn't go unnoticed." "No, it doesn't," Jessica said, "but believing something is not the same as proving it." Simon shrugged. "Maybe. But if you ask me, someone here had a good reason to want her out of the picture." He turned back to his desk and resumed his scribbling. Jessica stood a moment longer, then wandered further into the library, her curiosity sharpening. The old house had many rooms, but none quite so revealing as this one. It wasn't just the books, it was what people left behind when they thought no one was looking. She approached the far corner, a little alcove tucked behind a tall plant stand. There, beneath a small window, was a leather armchair and a side table holding an untouched teacup and a folded scrap of paper. Jessica glanced around. The others were still occupied. She picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a note, hastily scrawled in blue ink. "Meet me in the conservatory after dinner. We need to talk before she tells them everything." There was no signature. Jessica read it twice, her brows knitting together. "Before she tells them everything." Claudia? It had to be. The conservatory was at the rear of the house, humid, filled with tropical plants and hanging vines. Claudia had not appeared there last night. Or if she had, no one had mentioned it. Jessica folded the note and slipped it into her notebook, her mind beginning to weave a pattern. Someone in the house had arranged a meeting, perhaps to confront Claudia, perhaps to silence her. She moved to leave, but paused. A faint, scratching sound echoed from the far side of the library. Not a book being moved, more deliberate, steady, like paper being torn. She circled slowly back toward the sound and found Peter Langford hunched over a desk, shredding a page into narrow strips. "Oh," he gasped, startled. "Miss Fletcher, I didn't see you." Jessica eyed the pile of paper strips. "Burning old drafts?" Peter flushed. "Just something I shouldn't have written. Something private. Something angry," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wrote a letter to Claudia months ago. Never sent it. Found it in my journal earlier. Decided it was better off destroyed." "I see," he stood abruptly. "I should go lie down. This whole day has been—" He didn't finish the sentence. After he left, Jessica approached the waste bin and looked down at the remains. Torn, yes, but not obliterated. And if one was patient... Back in her room, she spent the better part of an hour rearranging the strips. The reconstructed message was disjointed but legible. "You humiliated me. I trusted you. You stole that chapter from my draft. I will never forgive you." Jessica sat back. So Peter had accused Claudia of theft. And not just emotionally, literary theft. That gave him a motive. But was motive enough? She glanced at the note from the library again. 2 people had wanted to speak with Claudia. One had written a threatening letter, the other had called her to a secret meeting. And someone, possibly one and the same, had followed her down the back staircase. Jessica stood and walked to the window. Rain was now pelting the glass, distorting the view of the garden below. A storm outside and one within. She reached for her notebook again. Thistlewood Hall was a house of stories, but not all of them were fiction. Chapter 4, Whispers and Alibis. The rain had eased by morning, but the air around Thistlewood Hall remained heavy, charged with something unspoken. A polite silence had fallen over the retreat, the sort that often precedes either a funeral or a scandal. Breakfast was subdued. Jessica Fletcher joined the others at the long dining table, where conversation fluttered nervously between the weather, Clarissa's scones, and which literary journals were currently accepting submissions. The topic of Claudia Lee, her sharp tongue, her sudden death, was tiptoed around with the delicacy usually reserved for family feuds and tax audits. Peter Langford avoided her gaze. Simon Gray looked particularly smug, which, Jessica noted, was suspicious in itself. Randolph Fielding, on the other hand, looked pale and distracted, sipping coffee he'd forgotten to add milk to. It was Clarissa, ever professional, who eventually broke the surface tension. "Sergeant Brewer will be back today. The coroner's review was inconclusive. He said he might have questions." Elsie Drummond tutted quietly. "I knew that staircase was dangerous. Should have been closed off years ago." Jessica stirred her tea. "Yes, but accidents don't usually involve secret meetings or unsigned notes." Clarissa blinked. "Pardon?" "Claudia received a note the night she died. Someone asked her to meet them in the conservatory after dinner." That prompted an immediate stir. "Who wrote it?" Peter asked, voice tight. "I don't know," Jessica replied calmly. "But I doubt it was a friendly invitation." Randolph stood abruptly. "We can't turn this into an inquisition. A tragic accident, that's what it was." Jessica studied him over her cup. "Then surely, Randolph, you won't mind if Sergeant Brewer conducts a few interviews?" He hesitated. "Of course not. I just think we all need to stay focused. This retreat means a great deal to me. I'd hate for it to be overshadowed by rumor." Jessica didn't respond, but she noted how his eyes flicked to Simon and then quickly away. Later that morning, Sergeant Brewer arrived in his weather-beaten car, wearing the same rumpled jacket as before and carrying a notebook that had clearly seen better days. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, offering a stiff nod, "may I have a word?" They settled in the parlor, away from the others. Jessica explained what she had found, the torn letter in the bin, the anonymous note, and the suspicious scuff on the staircase. Brewer frowned. "This complicates things." "You really think someone meant her harm?" "I think someone wanted her silence," Jessica replied. And Claudia wasn't exactly subtle about the things she knew. Brewer nodded slowly. "I'll speak with them all. One by one, see what turns up." That afternoon, the interviews began. The guests were summoned in turn to the library, the unofficial hub of inquiry. Jessica asked if she might observe. Brewer agreed, reluctantly. Peter Langford went first. He looked even paler than usual. "I was in the library most of the evening," he said. "After the reading, I went to write, or try to." Claudia's story rattled me. It felt like she was taunting me, bringing up the past. "Did you see her after dinner?" Brewer asked. "Number the Y went to bed early. I didn't even hear about her fall until Clarissa came shouting." Jessica studied him. His voice trembled, but there was something genuine in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, but not guilt. Simon Gray followed, arms folded, eyes defiant. "She liked pushing buttons," he said bluntly. "She thrived on drama, but I didn't kill her, if that's what you're implying." "No one's implying anything," Brewer said. Jessica leaned forward slightly. "Did you know about the note?" "Note? Inviting Claudia to the conservatory?" Simon hesitated. "Number. But if I had to guess, I'd say it was Peter. They had history." "That doesn't make him a murderer." Simon gave a half shrug. "Maybe not. But Claudia made enemies wherever she went. She liked being feared. Eventually, someone wasn't afraid anymore. Elsie Drummond came in next. Calm, composed. "She was cruel," Elsie said. "Not just in her writing, in her nature. She mocked my blog once, publicly, called it dusty and derivative. I laughed, but it stung." "Where were you after dinner?" "In the garden. I often take a walk before bed, helps me think. I saw Peter on the west path, near the fountain, alone." Jessica made a mental note. An alibi, or a coincidence? Randolph Fielding entered last. He looked tired. "I didn't see her that evening," he said. "I was in my study going over the next day's workshop." Jessica's tone was soft. "You seemed unsettled, Randolph. At dinner, and this morning?" He sighed. "It's the pressure. Hosting this retreat, I put my savings into this. Claudia threatened to expose certain things. Things that might have damaged the retreat." "Like what?" "She said I stole the format. That I borrowed ideas from another retreat she once attended and claimed as my own. She said she had proof. But I thought it was bluster. She enjoyed playing queen." Jessica let that sit in the air. "Did you write the note?" "No," he said quietly. "But I know she was planning something." That evening, the house fell into an uneasy hush. The wind had dropped, and with it, the warmth. Jessica sat again in the library, piecing threads together. Every guest had a motive, every alibi was thin. Then Clarissa appeared. "I've brought the retreat schedules," she said, handing Jessica a folder. "Figured you might want to look." Jessica thanked her and flipped it open. The first page was a simple itinerary. The second, however, was more interesting, a list of guest applications with notes beside each name. Claudia's had a red mark. "Not ideal. May cause friction. Keep her away from Peter." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "You screened everyone?" Clarissa hesitated. "It's standard. Randolph said it helps with group dynamics." "But you let Claudia in anyway." "She threatened legal action when we declined her, claimed it was bias. Randolph gave in." Jessica glanced back at the file. So Clarissa had known tensions were likely. She thanked her, waited for the door to close, then turned to the note again. "We need to talk before she tells them everything." But who was we? A single name wouldn't solve the puzzle. It was the connections that mattered, the quiet tensions, the whispered truths. And somewhere inside Thistlewood Hall, the truth was beginning to tremble its way to the surface. Chapter 5. The Locked Study. By Sunday morning, a curious mix of tension and routine had settled over Thistlewood Hall. Though the official schedule of workshops continued, an optional session on self-editing, followed by an author, Q&A, the guests seemed more interested in side glances and whispered theories than in creative exercises. Jessica Fletcher took her tea on the garden terrace where the grey sky cast a dull sheen over the distant sea. She sat quietly, notebook in hand, but her thoughts were nowhere near the page. Claudia's death wasn't a tragic fall. Of that she was now certain. And someone in this house had gone to considerable lengths to make it appear otherwise. What continued to trouble her, though, was the note, the one inviting Claudia to the conservatory. Someone had expected her there, yet no one admitted to sending it. Had Claudia ever made it to the meeting? If so, what had transpired afterward? That morning, while most of the others had gathered in the lounge for a slightly forced round-table discussion on narrative truth, Jessica quietly made her way toward Claudia's private writing room. Clarissa had called it a study, though it was really a converted servants' quarters at the end of the west wing, a narrow, oak-panelled corridor, few used except the staff. The door was closed and a discreet sign read, "Please do not disturb, in use during retreat." Jessica tried the handle, locked. She glanced down the hallway, no one in sight. A nearby cupboard revealed a ring of old brass keys, surely once used by housekeeping. With quiet efficiency, Jessica selected one and slid it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. Claudia's room was a precise reflection of her personality, elegant but theatrical. A velvet scarf draped over a lampshade tinted the room in amber light. A typewriter sat on the desk surrounded by crisp sheets of paper. Beside it, a leather folio monogrammed CL had been left slightly ajar. Jessica sat, opened it, and scanned the top page. It was a partial manuscript, Claudia's latest memoir from what she could tell. The title, The Final Chapter. The content, however, was unexpected. Far from a personal reflection, the pages described a scandal involving a writer's retreat, eerily similar to Thistlewood Hall, complete with veiled references to plagiarism, misappropriation of funds, and professional manipulation. A character named Rupert Faulkner was clearly based on Randolph Fielding. Jessica flipped through the pages until she reached the final one, only to find it ended abruptly. There was a missing chapter. She checked the folder again. Empty. The numbering skipped directly from chapter 8 to 10. She reached for Claudia's typewriter. The ribbon was fresh. A half sheet of paper remained rolled in the carriage, bearing the start of what appeared to be a now missing page. He said the retreat was a sanctuary for writers, but behind the polished manners and polite applause, something rotten grew. I saw it too late. Jessica's eyes narrowed. The missing chapter had likely been removed deliberately, perhaps by Claudia herself, but more likely by someone who had something to lose. Then she spotted it. Beneath the desk drawer, tucked just out of sight, was a small, folded piece of paper. Jessica retrieved it carefully. It was a list, 5 names, just initials, PLSGCTEDRF. Jessica didn't need to decode them. It was everyone at the retreat: Peter Langford, Simon Gray, Clarissa Trent, Elsie Drummond, and Randolph Fielding. Why had Claudia compiled such a list? It wasn't alphabetical, nor by room. Was it a ranking, a sequence? She copied the names into her notebook. A sharp creak from the hallway startled her. Jessica slipped the folder shut, returned everything as it had been, and quietly exited, locking the door behind her. As she replaced the key, she heard someone approach. It was Clarissa, clipboard clutched against her chest. "Oh, Miss Fletcher," she said with a forced smile. "Are you lost?" "Not at all," Jessica replied easily. "I was looking for the conservatory. I'm afraid I took a wrong turn." Clarissa gave a tight nod. "It's the east wing. This part of the house isn't usually open to guests." "I noticed," Jessica said mildly, "though I imagine it was open the night Claudia died." Clarissa stiffened. "What makes you say that?" Jessica's tone remained light. "Someone met her in the conservatory. Then she went down the servants' staircase. Clarissa opened her mouth, then closed it again. Would you happen to know if Claudia mentioned a manuscript before she died? Jessica continued. Perhaps something about the retreat itself? Clarissa hesitated. She said she was working on something bold, told Randolph it would be her best yet. I don't know more than that. Jessica nodded, watching her closely. Of course. Thank you, Clarissa. Back in her room, Jessica spread her notes across the desk. Claudia had been writing a tell-all, fictionalized perhaps, but damning nonetheless. She had warned at dinner that she knew secrets. She had compiled a list of the guests, and someone had ensured that last chapter disappeared. The door creaked open and Sergeant Brewer stepped in. Hope I'm not intruding, he said. We just heard from the coroner's office. There was bruising on Claudia's wrist. Defensive, possibly. Not conclusive, but enough to call it suspicious. Jessica folded her arms. Then it's officially a murder investigation. It is, Brewer said grimly. And now I need to know which of our guests had the most to lose. Jessica gestured to the notes. I think it's time we found that missing chapter. Chapter 6. Fireside Revelations. The drawing room that evening was dimly lit, the fire burning low in the hearth. Rain whispered against the tall windows, but inside the mood was far from peaceful. The guests had gathered by silent agreement. No one said it aloud, but each of them knew that a reckoning was approaching. Jessica Fletcher sat in her favorite armchair near the fire, notebook resting lightly on her lap. Her eyes, however, remained on the others. Peter Langford stood at the sideboard, stirring brandy into his tea with unsteady hands. Elsie Drummond was knitting, furiously, as though each stitch might muffle a rising anxiety. Simon Gray lounged on the sofa, looking far too relaxed, a smirk flickering at the corners of his mouth. Randolph Fielding, pacing near the fire, looked tired. Clarissa stood behind a wing-back chair, her clipboard nowhere in sight. It was Randolph who broke the silence. This is absurd, he said. The sergeant has all but accused us of murder, and no one is saying a word. It's not an accusation, Randolph, Jessica said gently. It's an investigation. And if we truly want the truth, we must be willing to ask difficult questions. He turned to her. And you're the one to ask them, I suppose? I never intended to become involved, Jessica replied. But I find myself unable to ignore the evidence. What evidence? Clarissa snapped, voice sharper than usual. Jessica looked at her calmly. A note asking Claudia to meet in the conservatory. A missing chapter from her manuscript. A list of initials. A suspicious fall. Shall I go on? Clarissa's lips tightened. You're speculating? Jessica leaned forward. No, I'm observing. There's a difference. Silence fell again. The fire crackled. Peter cleared his throat. You think one of us lured her downstairs? Killed her? Possibly, Jessica said. Or perhaps she discovered something she wasn't meant to and someone panicked. Elsie put down her knitting. Do you really think someone here is capable of murder? Jessica didn't answer immediately. She looked instead at Simon, whose smirk had faded. Simon, she said slowly, you were the last to read that night. What was your story about? He raised an eyebrow. A detective who finds himself accused of a crime he didn't commit. Jessica nodded. And in it, the killer removed the only piece of physical evidence. Interesting coincidence, Peter murmured. Simon scoffed. Are you accusing me of writing a confession in metaphor? Not at all, Jessica said. But it's curious how often truth sneaks into fiction, especially among writers. Randolph finally sat, rubbing his temples. Claudia threatened to expose us all. She said this retreat was a sham, that I was a fraud, that she had proof. Jessica looked at him. Did she? "I don't know," he muttered. "Maybe. She always exaggerated." "She didn't exaggerate about the manuscript," Jessica said. "It exists. Or did." Clarissa shifted uneasily. "You think it's still here?" "I think someone took it after her death, perhaps even before." Jessica reached into her notebook and pulled out the folded list she'd found in Claudia's study. She handed it to Sergeant Brewer, who had quietly entered and stood by the door, observing. "Initials," Brewer read aloud. "Each guest." Jessica nodded. She knew something, perhaps about all of us. The room grew still. Then Peter spoke. "There's something I didn't tell you before," he said, eyes on the floor. "Claudia called me the afternoon before she died. She asked to meet in the conservatory, said she had something to show me." Jessica leaned forward. "But you didn't go?" "I wanted to, but I was afraid." She made it sound urgent, almost desperate. "Did anyone else know?" "No," Peter said. "Or I didn't think so." Jessica turned to Clarissa. "You manage the retreat's mail, don't you?" Clarissa nodded slowly. "Why? Did you see Claudia receive anything unusual in the days before her death? A parcel, perhaps?" Clarissa paused. "A small padded envelope arrived, no return address. I gave it to her myself." Jessica stood. "Then I think we know what's missing, whatever was in that envelope. Possibly the missing chapter, possibly something else." Brewer looked up. "You think someone took it after she died?" "I think someone took it before." Simon chuckled. "Are you saying one of us broke into her room, stole the manuscript, and then pushed her down the stairs to cover it up?" Jessica looked at him. "Something like that." Simon's laugh faded. Jessica turned to Randolph. "Your office is just down the hall from Claudia's room, isn't it?" He nodded. "Would anyone else have access to her study?" Randolph hesitated. "Clarissa has keys. I don't technically, but I know where the spare set is kept." Jessica turned back to Clarissa. "Where were you between 9 and 10 that night?" Clarissa blinked. "I was in the laundry room, preparing linens." "Alone?" "Yes." Jessica glanced at Brewer. "Then I'd suggest we search the offices, the storage cupboards, and the laundry room." Brewer nodded. "Right away." Clarissa looked ready to protest, but something stopped her. As Brewer left, Jessica returned to her seat. She studied the fire a moment before speaking again. "Someone here wanted to silence Claudia," she said quietly. "But I think the manuscript, or whatever was in that envelope, still exists." Elsie looked up. "And if it's found?" "Then we'll know the truth," Jessica replied. "And perhaps the killer won't be able to hide behind whispers much longer." Outside, the wind picked up again. Inside, silence settled like dust. But Jessica could feel it. Truth drawing closer, like the moment before lightning strikes. Chapter 7. A walk before dawn. The house had gone still again. It was well past midnight when Jessica Fletcher stirred from her bed, sleep having eluded her. A restless energy clung to the air, thick and unyielding. Something about Claudia's list, the missing chapter, and the envelope delivered days before. Something about it all kept scratching at the edge of her thoughts, just out of reach. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, lit the small lamp on her nightstand, and glanced at her notebook once more. The initials, the envelope, the note inviting Claudia to the conservatory. What if the missing piece wasn't hidden inside the house at all? She slipped her notebook into her pocket and opened her door as quietly as possible. The hallway was silent, the old floorboards cool beneath her slippers. Jessica moved carefully, listening to the faint creaks and groans of the sleeping house as she made her way down the grand staircase and through the back corridor that led to the garden entrance. Outside, the mist had settled low to the ground, Moonlight filtered weakly through the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel path. She followed it past the daffodil beds and over the narrow footbridge that arched above a dry stream. The air smelled of damp leaves and old wood. The conservatory loomed ahead, its glass panels glinting faintly. Jessica stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The scent of soil and green things welcomed her, the mingling fragrances of orchids, ivy, and rosemary. Everything was in its place. Except something was not quite right. A boot print. Just one. Faint, muddy, and half-smeared, it marked the wooden floor near the left-hand bench. Jessica knelt beside it, shining her torch. The print was too large for Claudia and too narrow to belong to Peter. Likely male, but not recent, perhaps a few nights old. She rose and turned toward the gardener's shed beyond the conservatory. It had been locked every time she passed it before, but tonight the padlock hung open, chain coiled loosely on the door handle. A whisper of intuition urged her forward. Inside, the air was damp and earthy. Tools lined the walls, rakes, shears, bags of peat moss. But on the far shelf, behind a rusted watering can, sat something wholly out of place. A manuscript envelope. Jessica's heart beat faster. She retrieved it carefully, brushing off a layer of soil. Her name had been written on it in Claudia's unmistakable hand. Inside were 12 typed pages, the missing chapter. She returned quickly to the main house, locking the garden door behind her. In the dim light of the parlor, she read through Claudia's final words, words written with sharp precision and undeniable intent. Each guest is here for a reason. Not for writing, but for hiding. They've all stolen something, an idea, a story, a moment of truth. Peter took my structure. Elsie mimicked my voice. Simon copied my pacing. Clarissa, well, she knows, and Randolph, he made a career of my stolen retreat model. I know, I kept the letters, I have the proof, and if they try to silence me, let this serve as my final truth. Jessica sat back, breath shallow. It wasn't a chapter, it was a confession and an accusation. The envelope also contained 2 letters folded and faded, one from Randolph to a former colleague discussing borrowing themes from Claudia's program, and another, more damning, was a contract between Claudia and a publishing imprint Clarissa had once worked with, showing she had helped kill Claudia's early proposal in favor of Randolph's. So that was the secret. Claudia hadn't just been threatening, she had every reason to expose them, and now someone had ensured she never would. But Jessica now held the final piece. At dawn, with mist still hanging over the trees, Jessica requested that Sergeant Brewer return immediately. She asked the rest of the retreat to assemble in the drawing room. No one argued. Randolph sat pale and sweating. Clarissa's usual polish had cracked slightly, her nails tapping the arm of her chair. Peter looked haunted. Simon crossed his arms, his face unreadable. Elsie gripped her knitting bag like a lifeline. Jessica stood before them, the envelope tucked under her arm. I believe I've found what Claudia meant to share, she said, and I think the time has come to reveal it. She pulled the manuscript pages free, letting her gaze rest on each of them in turn. Claudia discovered that she had been betrayed by nearly everyone in this room. Some copied her style, others dismissed her professionally. And one of you stole her retreat model, then tried to erase the trail. Randolph opened his mouth, but Jessica raised a hand. Let me finish. She laid out the letters for Sergeant Brewer. This contract and this correspondence proved that Claudia had grounds for everything she claimed. Clarissa stared at the papers, lips parted. She was going to expose you all, Jessica continued. But she never got the chance, because someone took the manuscript, hid it in the gardener's shed, and then met her in the conservatory. There was an argument. perhaps a struggle, and then a fall. "Are you saying it was premeditated?" Brewer asked. "No," Jessica said softly. "I believe it was a confrontation gone wrong, but the cover-up was deliberate." She turned to Clarissa. "You had motive, you had keys, you had access to every part of the house. You intercepted Claudia's envelope and knew exactly what it contained." Clarissa's face had drained of colour. "I didn't kill her," she whispered. I panicked. She said she'd ruin everything, that no one would believe I didn't help steal it all. I took the chapter. I thought if she couldn't prove it..." She broke off. Jessica's voice was gentle. "But she followed you, or you followed her. Either way, it ended with her death." Brewer stepped forward slowly. "I'll need you to come with me, Miss Trent." Clarissa didn't argue. As she rose, Jessica looked at the others. "She wasn't blameless," Jessica said softly. "But Claudia deserved justice, and the truth, however uncomfortable, has a way of revealing itself." Outside, the mist lifted, and with it the final shadow of Thistlewood Hall. Chapter 8. Murder in Retrospect. By Monday morning, Thistlewood Hall had returned to a strange semblance of order. The rain had passed, the mist had cleared, and the retreat's guests, those who remained, walked a little softer, spoke a little quieter, as if the house itself demanded reverence in the wake of truth. Jessica Fletcher sat in the breakfast room, a fresh pot of coffee beside her, rereading the final chapter of Claudia Lee's manuscript. Not for the evidence, it had already done its job, but for what lay beneath the words. Claudia had not just wanted to accuse, she'd wanted to be understood, and in her own way, remembered. Sergeant Brewer had taken Clarissa into custody at first light. She'd made a full confession before they'd even reached town. According to Brewer, the confrontation in the conservatory had escalated quickly. Claudia had threatened to go public. Clarissa had tried to stop her from leaving, grabbing her wrist. Claudia broke free, angry, humiliated, and stormed off. Clarissa had followed. "I didn't push her," she had said. "She slipped, but I didn't help her either." Jessica believed her. There had been no intent to kill, but the moment had spiraled. And the silence that followed, Clarissa hiding the manuscript, feigning shock, and letting suspicion swirl around the others, that was the real betrayal. Justice, Jessica knew, wasn't always neat, but it had arrived. She closed the folder and looked up to find Peter Langford standing nearby, holding 2 mugs of tea. "I thought you might want one," he said, offering her the second cup. Jessica accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Peter. How are you holding up?" He gave a small, wry smile. "Still trying to figure out if I should write about all this, or never write again." Jessica chuckled softly. "You're a writer. That means you'll do both, in time." He sat across from her. "I keep thinking about Claudia. She was a lot of things, difficult, brilliant, infuriating, but she didn't deserve this." "No," Jessica agreed, "but her words will still be read, and I think, in her own way, she would have considered that a victory." Peter nodded, then hesitated. "You were incredible, the way you saw through it all." Jessica sipped her tea. "I didn't do anything magical. I listened, paid attention. People always leave traces, words, habits, reactions. Most mysteries aren't about the crime. They're about the people behind it." He looked thoughtful at that. "And what will you do now?" he asked. Jessica smiled. "Well, I imagine I'll go back to Cabot Cove, work on my next book, feed the cat, do some gardening." Peter laughed. "It all seems so normal." Jessica's eyes twinkled. "Normal's underrated." That afternoon, Randolph Fielding summoned the remaining guests for a final gathering in the drawing room. The retreat, he announced, would conclude early. Refunds would be issued, and Thistlewood Hall would remain closed until further notice. He looked tired. Hollow, almost. Whatever illusions he had maintained about the retreat's success had been irrevocably shattered. Jessica approached him quietly after the others had dispersed. "I hope you'll keep writing," she said gently. Randolph gave a humorless laugh. "After all this?" "Especially after all this," she replied. "Stories can save us, even when reality disappoints." He nodded slowly. "Perhaps I just need time to face it all." Jessica left him to his thoughts. Before her car arrived, Jessica wandered once more through the house. She passed the library where the grandfather clock ticked solemnly. She glanced into the conservatory where a single orchid had bloomed since the morning Claudia died. She paused outside the now unlocked study, where a faint scent of lavender lingered. She didn't need to go inside again. Some rooms, once understood, asked only to be left in peace. As the driver loaded her suitcase into the boot, Peter came rushing down the front steps. "I almost forgot," he said, breathlessly. "Claudia's agent called. They want to publish the manuscript, all of it, even the final chapter." Jessica blinked. "They're going through with it?" "Yes. They said it would be a tribute, a warning, and, well, a literary event." Jessica smiled faintly. Claudia would have liked that. She never wanted to be loved, just heard. He nodded. "I'll send you a copy when it's out." She touched his arm. "Just make sure they get the acknowledgements right." Then she climbed into the car, and the driver pulled away. The road from Thistlewood Hall twisted gently through the trees. Spring was finally beginning to bloom, greening branches, birdsong, and the promise of warmth returning to the coast. Jessica watched the landscape roll past, her thoughts drifting between characters both fictional and real. She thought of Claudia, fiery, flawed, determined, of Clarissa, so polished, so controlled, undone by a single moment, of Peter, Simon, Elsie, of the truths each carried, the fears, the secrets, and the stories still unwritten. Back in Cabot Cove, she would sit at her kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea and a blank page in front of her. But this time, perhaps, the story would begin not with a mystery, but with a garden, a retreat, and a woman with too many secrets and just one chance to tell them, because every story, Jessica knew, began with someone who dared to speak, even if the truth came after the final chapter.